The following is a presentation of the Pixels and Piledrivers podcast network. And welcome back inside the CKDJ studios right here for a podcast special edition of Pixels and Piledrivers. My name is Colin the Music Man. Hello to all of our fans out there in the UK. Hello to all the fans of the Retro Hour. The following is an interview that I did with none other than Dan Wood and Ravi Abbott. Of course, two of the main hosts on the Retro Hour podcast. We spent a little bit of time talking about themselves and what sort of got them into gaming. We then sort of went over a brief history of video games, if you will. The interview lasts about an hour. Hope you enjoy.
Hey, I'm Dan Wood.
I'm Ravi Abbott.
And we're from the Retro Hour podcast. And you're listening to Pixels and Piledrivers.
Welcome back inside the CKDJ studios right here for Pixels and Piledrivers on CKDJ 107.9 Ottawa's new music. Of course, I am your host, Colin the Music Man. Alongside me on the line all the way from Nottingham in Great Britain, we've got Ravi Abbott and Dan Wood of the Retro Hour podcast. How's it going today, guys?
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah, great to be speaking to you. And you're right, we're from the middle of England, Nottingham.
Yeah,
we appreciate the invitation. It's great to be on.
Yeah, now before we start off with the questions, this is a huge thing for me. Dan, I was telling Ravi before we started the interview here, I've been listening to you guys since about May of 2018, right around, I believe. That would have been right around episode 100 or so?
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah.
Probably.
It was actually episode one. I went back. The first episode that I listened to you guys was episode 100, right, with Nolan Bushnell. And I'm like, okay, if you guys, like, Nolan Bushnell is probably, I don't want to say it sucks that he's not even synonymous with video games, especially in 2019, but he's definitely the guy who really kicked it all off.
Oh yeah, with the Pong machine and everything.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. We thought we really need to get someone good for episode 100, and it just worked out that we got Nolan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was quite difficult. I think we worked on getting Nolan Bushnell. I think it was about a 6-month process to actually get him on, because usually when you get to guests at that level, you're normally going to go via their agent or a PR company and that kind of thing. But luckily we know a guy called Jörg, who runs a podcast in Germany, who'd gone through a similar process about a year before, who kind of opened a bit of a door with Nolan for us. So we managed to get him on for our 100th episode. And for anyone that loves video games, he's definitely one of the founding fathers of the video games industry.
Yeah, for sure. Now we'll talk a little bit about more of the history of video games a little later on. But to start off, not too many of our fans necessarily know that much about you guys. So the first question that I've got for you guys today, what would be either your first or your favorite video game memory growing up?
Oh gosh, I think my favorite video game memory, it's not my first, but we'd be playing on the PlayStation, and it was one of these wrestling games, and it was probably the funniest thing I ever witnessed when I was a kid. But you could just smack each other on the face with these huge bells, and we made these grotesquely huge characters and spent the whole time smacking each other in and out of the ring. And that was entertaining on its own.
I think for me, the first memory, and I've talked about this before on our podcast, is I remember being about 5 years old probably, and my dad went to see one of his friends. And his friend had a son, and it's like when you're a kid, you talk to any other kid, don't you? Get on with everyone. And he had a son who was in his room, so I went up. I'm like, "Oh, hi, I'm Dan. How are you?" And he was playing on a Nintendo, an NES, and he had a game on there called Kung Fu Master. And I remember I was watching it on the screen. I'd never really played a video game before, And I was just, drawn to it. And he passed the controller over to me and he's like, do you want to go? And I'm like, yeah. And that kind of started a lifelong love for the genre, really.
Definitely. Now, what sort of, I'll ask you a couple of questions here, sort of relating to the same sort of theme here. What was your favorite console, let's say, what was your favorite retro game console?
I'd have to say it's the Mega Drive. I just think due to the popularity of the Mega Drive over here in the UK, everybody had one. So it'd be like, one guy would buy a copy of Sonic 3 and then share it between all its friends. And it meant that all the games were really played really well. And there's some absolute classic fighting games on there and stuff like Cyborg Justice was one of my favorite. But really the Mega Drive for me was the kind of main console.
Yeah, at the risk of giving a boring answer, I think that if we're talking about consoles, the Mega Drive would be definitely up there in my top 2 or 3 as well. I mean, I think, it's called a Genesis, I believe it was in Canada. But I mean, I was more of a, because over here it was a little bit different to many parts of the world. Home computers were really the main thing here in, the 80s and early 90s. So kids at school had Commodore 64s and Sinclair Spectrums, and the Commodore Amiga was the machine that was really my main gaming platform until around probably the mid-90s, really, until we got a PlayStation in our house. So in terms of consoles, I mean, I did have friends who had consoles, but it was really more home computers for me. But I mean, if I did have to pick, one console that I loved apart from the Genesis, probably the Nintendo 64, just because I think it's got such an interesting architecture, and it seemed so revolutionary when that system came along. And it really did feel like Nintendo were at the forefront of technology when that system came out.
For sure. Now, the Commodore 64, I hate to be that guy who brags quite a bit. The Commodore 64 is actually a Canadian invention, I believe. Now, what with everything not necessarily being the most distributable back then in the 80s and 90s, what do you think led to the Commodore 64 and the Commodore Amiga's popularity over in the UK?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think really, I mean, Commodore, the company behind it, always had an ethos of the guy that founded the company, Jack Tramiel. He had a kind of a mantra, which was computers for the masses, not for the classes. So I think it was affordability. Because you've got to remember, back then in the mid '80s, when the Commodore 64 really became popular, I believe over here they cost about £200. But if you're talking other machines, I mean, generally, you look at Apple Macintoshes, they were thousands of pounds, so they were far out of reach of the general consumer. So I think the fact that these machines were affordable, they had a good games library, and also one thing I will attribute to their success is how easily available games were to people, because they weren't that hard to make duplications of games for your friends.
Yeah, with the floppy disks.
Well.
But also, I think with the piracy, I think applications as well were massively pirated. So if somebody wanted to do some high-end video work, or they wanted to do 3D rendering in Lightwave, that would cost like £600-700 to buy the actual application sometimes. And there'd be a pirate version out there on floppy disks, and people could use all this really powerful industry software and kind of only have a few originals. It was pretty rampant in Europe.
For sure. Now, if we're talking specifically about British computers, there's one name that definitely stands out from any others, really. And you guys have poked fun, sort of made jokes about Lord Alan Sugar. But talk to us in Canada and in North America about the history of Amstrad.
Yeah,
Dan.
Yeah. Yes, I was going to say, they're an interesting company. Alan Sugar, for those who don't know him, I mean, he's very famous in Britain because he hosts our version of The Apprentice. And he has, for a couple of decades now. But he was, a working class lad from London who kind of worked his way up, really. I mean, he's been involved in so many different industries. I think he started doing market stall trading, and then kind of got into electronics because it was, the up and coming thing, starting with stuff like, hi-fis and that kind of thing. But then he founded a company called Amstrad. You mentioned there about him having a big foot in the computer industry over here. I mean, really, at its peak, it was kind of the third player, really, because there was two companies. Obviously, the Commodore 64 was big here, but also Sinclair was probably the second player in the home computer industry in Britain in the 80s, and that was founded by Clive Sinclair, who later sold his company to Alan Sugar, and then it became part of Amstrad. So, I mean, there is a bit of a synergy between all those British computer companies. And there's another one called Acorn that actually came out of Sinclair that had a very big hold in the school education market. So any kid that you talk to who grew up in Britain in the 80s and early 90s would have used Acorn computers at school because they were like the de facto standard. So, I mean, really, you can trace it all back to Cambridge, really. That's where most of these companies came from.
And also with Amstrad, they had a strategy, not like the other guys, which was kind of aim for America, aim for these areas. They were aiming for Europe. So Alan Sugar kind of went in a different direction to all the other guys. He was going for France and places like that.
For sure. Now, am I reading this correctly? Just before, we'll move on from Amstrad in a second. But am I reading this correctly that Alan Sugar named it sort of after himself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Alan Michael Sugar. So yeah, it's on Wikipedia if you look it up.
Yeah, Alan Michael Sugar Trading is what I'm reading up here.
Yeah, that's
you see, I don't know if you've ever seen Only Fools and Horses, but there's a guy called Del Boy who's our very dodgy trader, and he's very like Alan Sugar.
I haven't seen that, but I'll take a look at it. Now, we'll sort of go over the history of video games for a little bit, and then we'll just talk about why retro games are so popular, especially in 2019. In and around the 1980s, we had sort of a boom with the beginning of the 8-bit era. Then in 1983, Activision put out E.T. What do you think made that game so bad?
Oh,
well, we did a whole episode about it, didn't we?
Yeah. And the thing was, we talked to Howard, the actual designer, Howard Scott Warshaw, who was going across America whilst he was talking to us. And he was saying, actually, he was only given around 2 weeks to finish this game, which would have taken absolute months. And I think there was a lot more rubbish titles as well before E.T. E.T. was just the turning point because the film was so popular. People went out and bought a copy of that game and were completely disappointed, And I don't think it was Howard's fault, actually. I think it was probably the guys, Activision, saying, right, get this game out as fast as possible, Well,
Atari, when they came up with the concept of that game, I mean, really it was, the head of these big companies, like Warner Brothers, for example, they saw the video games industry a bit like the toy market. So there wasn't enough quality control. It was more a case of, the most important thing was getting this big name license on the shelf. And they didn't know what made a good game or a bad game. And like Ravi said then, it was designed by a single guy who only had a few weeks, which really, I mean, you imagine even starting a video game or thinking about it in a few weeks' time would be unthinkable, even like an independent game today. So the fact that he managed to get anything out released at all, I think, is a testament to what a good programmer he is. And when we talked to him, he actually did admit that, looking back at the game, it did have some design problems and maybe it was made a little bit too difficult for the casual player who would have been attracted to the game. But I think, it is a miracle that he even got it out there at all in the limited time that he had.
Yeah. Now, after the video game crash in North America of 1983, that both the Famicom and SG-1000 came out to the North American market. Why, at what point did everybody realize that video games weren't actually dead? Like, what console sort of really restarted it? Would it have been the NES, or would it have been like something like the Master System or the TurboGrafx or something like that?
Yeah, I think especially in America it was the NES, but the way they did it is, I mean, after the video games crash, no kind of mainstream retailer wanted to touch video games because, a lot of them had lost a lot of money on it. So Nintendo actually came up with a bit of a genius marketing move, actually, because when the NES was first released in America, I don't know if you remember Rob the Robot.
Yep.
He was like a little toy that they bundled with the machine. And the reason they did this is they were going to the big retailers and saying, look, this is a toy. It's not so much a video game. They want to get this in toy retailers. So then the retailers had a bit more confidence in stocking the NES. And then obviously when it became popular, they pretty swiftly dropped that toy accessory that came with it. And the games kind of stood on their own 2 feet. But yeah, the resurgence of it, I mean, really it was down to Nintendo. But it's quite interesting that we didn't actually have a video game scratch over here in Europe. Because again, it was, the home computers were really prevalent here and people were doing a lot of other things with them. And actually the Sega Master System was a popular system over here, but not so much in America.
And we had a third-party distributor. So Sega weren't even here. It was through Mastertronics. So we had all these kind of distributors like US Gold that would take American games and then port them over for us. So then eventually Sega came, but the Master System was incredibly popular here.
Right. Now, moving on we'll get to sort of my era in gaming in a little bit. But after the third generation, the NES discontinued in 1995. We had the 16-bit era. What do you think the most successful console? I'll ask you guys over in the UK. What was the most successful console in the 16-bit era for you guys?
Yeah, speaking personally, I think for me it was the Sega Mega Drive was a system that I saw, most of my friends' houses, for example, and when I went into stores and watched television. I mean, I think the Super Nintendo didn't come out until I think it was about 2 years after the Mega Drive here, known as a Genesis over in Canada. So I think that allowed the Sega to get a bit more of a foothold in the market before Nintendo came along. And they had a pretty aggressive marketing campaign where really, it was the same in North America as well. They were literally targeting all their advertising at ridiculing Nintendo recently. So Sega came along as this brash newcomer, and suddenly all the kids wanted to own it because it seemed really cool.
Yeah, and then the whole Genesis does what Nintendo don't came about, and then it all...
I think they called... when Sonic the Hedgehog came along, they referred to Mario as a fat little plumber. So...
Sorry, is Ravi still there too?
Oh, yeah.
No, I was
16. 16-bit systems, kind of the Amiga was actually Amiga 500 was one of the most popular selling ones, but then that was still, some people called it a console and some a computer. It was in that in between kind of section. But I don't think I ever saw any SNESers anywhere.
I had one friend that had one, yeah.
Yeah, SNESers were really, really rare.
Yeah. Now, a question about the computers, really. Were they sort of like the computers that we know today that just had exclusive games released for them?
No, there used to be, generally back then, a lot of games would come out on all platforms, which was probably quite difficult if you think of it from a publisher's point of view, because today you've got if you want to have a successful console game, for example, you've only got 3 platforms to deal with, really. 4 if you count the PC. But back then, there could be as many as 10 different home computer formats, and then they might want to get it out on the consoles as well. So a lot of the interviews we do in our podcast, when we've talked to game publishers or managers of labels who were big in the 80s and 90s, they may have teams or be subcontracting people to maybe do 13, 14, 15 different ports of a single game.
Yeah, it was crazy fragmented because of all of the different systems. And often they would have, the master port would be on the Atari ST. So the Atari ST was actually a less kind of powerful graphically than the Amiga. So you'd be getting a lower quality version as the original one, and then that lower quality one would be quickly ported to a powerful system, but because it comes from that really low quality and quite a bad palette of color, it would often be really terrible. So you get some absolutely awful ports coming across.
Are there any specific ports that you can think of off the top of your head that were successful on one console, like on a console or a home computer, and then were absolutely terrible vice versa?
Sorry, go, Ravi.
I think Mortal Kombat was absolutely awful on the Amigas and stuff, and they actually put a thing to stop piracy in there. So if it was pirated, your version of Sonya wouldn't be able to actually do anything. But I also think the Street Fighter versions were quite horrendous. I remember they even did Street Fighter for the ZX Spectrum.
Oh, God.
If you think about that.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so low.
I do remember a lot of the time then you'd often get, home arcade ports. Because you've got to remember, in the late 80s and early 90s, the systems that you had at home weren't anywhere near as powerful as what you'd play in the arcade. And you'd often be quite disappointed when, for example, you brought home, I remember Paperboy. It was a very successful arcade game. And at the time, I had a system called the Commodore Plus 4. And that was an even less powerful system than the Commodore 64. And they tried to port Paperboy to it, and I got really excited. I'm going to be able to play this game just like in the arcade at home. And then I put it on, it had like 2 colors, and I think it moved at about half a frame a second. So, yeah, it didn't resemble the arcade in the slightest.
Yeah, you can. The ZX Spectrum, correct me if I'm wrong, they were, that was a vector-based graphics computer, right?
It wasn't vector-based, no, surprise.
It was 4 colors, though.
It was 4 colors, yeah.
And they bleed as well really badly onto the other colors.
Yeah, that would be amazing to try and play Mortal Kombat on something like that in 2019. That would be like the equivalent of porting Mortal Kombat 11 to something like GameCube or like a 64 or something like that. You guys...
Well, you'd even...
Sorry, go ahead.
You'd have those Tiger handheld units as well.
Yeah.
And they'd say like, oh, this is Mortal Kombat. Like a kick and a punch. That was it.
Yeah. You have 2 buttons. One of them does one thing. One of them punches left. The other one punches right. And if you hit them both together, you can do some sort of spear type move or something like that.
Yeah. I remember getting Outrun on one of them, the racing game Outrun on one of those little handhelds. And yeah, it had like, the background was a picture, that was drawn, and then just had this little monochrome car moving left and right, and that was it.
Yeah. Now, just 2 weeks ago, you guys released a panel episode that you did at your... It was in Norway, I believe? It was Norway, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you released that panel with a lot of the big guys from Rare. Some of the guys... like David Doak, GoldenEye, Chris Marlowe on Pile did Conker's Bad Fur Day, David Wise worked on the Donkey Kong Country series, and then you had Kevin Bayliss from Battletoads and Killer Instinct. What do you guys think led Rare to be arguably one of the most popular game publishers from like the 80s and 90s?
I think it's to do with the kind of science behind it and the experimentation. I think there'd be a lot of companies that would set and do their own things. But if you look at stuff like even the AI on GoldenEye, it's incredible. You've got AI that can call reinforcements, that can, stuff that was never done in games before. And also the fact they use motion capture, silicon graphics stuff in there. They were really, really pushing the limit on the games. And a lot of other companies would have just been happy to sit there, use someone else's engine and just pump a title out. But these guys really innovated. And I think that's what led them to create such exciting games.
Yeah, and I think they were always very technically innovative. They were always looking for the next thing. I mean, you think of when Rare started in 1987, they came out of a company called Ultimate Play the Game, which the Stamper brothers founded before that, the founders of Rare. But the Ultimate, their previous company, focused on the ZX Spectrum as its main platform. And then Rare came along in 87 and really, pretty much focused almost solely on the Nintendo Entertainment System, which, as we mentioned before, at the time wasn't really a very popular platform here in Britain, but they were looking outside of the kind of limited home computer market and looking at what was going to be the next big thing. And that kind of continued, throughout Rare in the 90s as well. I mean, during that panel we did, we spoke to the guys who, when they were making Donkey Kong Country, the fact they were getting in these silicon graphics workstations that cost millions and millions of pounds to do this really high-end 3D rendering to make these games look like something no one had ever seen before. So I think Rare were always looking for how can we impress people and really push these systems to their limit.
For sure. Now, What were your favorite, or what is your favorite Rare game that came out?
Ooh, that's a hard one.
Yeah. I'll give you more than one. Let's say if you had like a 3 or a 5 or something like that.
Okay, well, I'd say because after Rare, a few people split and formed their own group, and they released it's called Free Radical Designs. Because initially, I knew David Doak when I was a little kid in Rare, and that's how we kind of formed the relationship early on. But yeah, Free Radical did Time Splitters, which was a fantastic kind of follow-on to the GoldenEye style multiplayer game, but it was more set in a sci-fi setting. But that meant you could get more kind of sci-fi weapons, which were really cool. But I still think GoldenEye is just the number one kind of sit down with your mates and play, because there was so much innovation in there. Stuff like the mines, explodable furniture. I don't think they had that in previous titles as well.
Yeah, I think that game as well, like you said, it was one of the first, well, probably the first console experience where you could sit down and have a 4-player FPS game on a console at home on a couch with your friends. So, I mean, that again for me has got loads of great memories. And Battletoads, which I know our team on our podcast are a bit divided on it. I don't know if you're a fan, Ravi. I know our co-host Joe doesn't like it, but
I've only played bad versions.
Yeah,
I always Donkey Kong Country, which is actually my wife's favorite video game of all time. So, if we ever get the Super Nintendo set up, she enjoys that. And Diddy Kong Racing I loved as well. I thought that was a great little racing game.
Yeah. Now, Ravi, you've when you said you played horrible versions, I'm assuming you played the Amiga port of Battletoads?
Yeah, that suffers from the Amiga one-button fire, where basically you have to do all the moves with one button, which is just awful.
That was going to be my follow-up question to talking about Rare, was if Ravi actually ended up playing the Battletoads version on the Amiga. Now we'll sort of move over to just like a general forum-type discussion. Mega Man, I've been playing a lot, because I just got myself into retro games a couple months ago, like actually playing them and everything. I've been playing a lot of them. What
got you into them?
Sorry?
What got you into retro games then?
Well, obviously I have to say listening to you guys' podcast, but it was only after I discovered a program called RetroArch that I was able to sort of really fall in love with a lot of different game franchises. Because I don't know how old you guys think I actually am myself. I'm only 18 years of age.
Cool.
So
I'm glad you're getting into retro, a new generation.
It's not, there are definitely some things about games that were released before my time that I do enjoy a lot more than games that are being released now. One of the main ones being the price. But I've been playing a lot of Mega Man on the SNES and the NES recently. It got to about, I think it was Mega Man 7 that I started to fall off, though. Mega Man 7, the first game in the franchise released for the SNES. The dialogue boxes that would stop you every, 10 seconds, I don't understand why they did that.
Yeah, talking of Rare stuff, actually, I've been playing ukulele recently, and just the dialogue boxes, I'm just like, shut up, I don't want to hear what you're saying. Continue. It kind of slows the pace of the game down a bit.
Yeah, when we've had, you've got to remember back then, it's, they didn't have the space to put speech in there. You can actually hear them talking. So the only way they could really convey the story was either via giving you a printed book with it all in, or, putting these bits of dialogue in the game. But I think you're right there, because we've had conversations with game developers on our podcast before where they've had a bit of a battle between, do we focus on the story of the game? Does the player really care about it? Or do they just want to get to the action? And, are we slowing it down? So I do know that was often a point of debate when they were designing these games back in the day.
For sure. Now, Capcom themselves are known, definitely. I can't necessarily make a list of all the different best sort of game publishers. Capcom is one of them that comes to mind. Konami, although I think it was it Konami that had sort of their own little problems going on?
Yeah, I think so. And there was quite a few of British ones as well, and there was quite a few throughout Europe as well. I think one of my favourite developers is Team 17, who still seem to be going these days, and I think that's one of the great ones that's kind of held a light aloft for really good games for a long time.
For sure. No.
Yeah,
go ahead, Dan.
Talking about them, I know there has been some stuff in the news over the last couple of years about how they apparently treated their employees and stuff like that. So I mean, it's there has been some stuff written about the company, but I mean, they're a legendary company, have been around for a hell of a long time. I think they were founded similar to a lot of these companies. I think they've been around since like the 1960s. So a lot of these companies existed even before video games came along. I mean, Nintendo were founded over 100 years ago.
And we can always find someone that's really hardcore in a company as well. Like Commodore was famous for having Jack Tramiel, who used to do these things called jack attacks on people and basically completely berate them and destroy them on the spot. So I think there's always some hardcore managers in games companies somewhere.
Oh, for sure. There's hardcore managers everywhere. Now, what do you think? I mean, because retro games in the past little bit they weren't really considered retro games, because at the time, like let's say 10, 15 years ago, they weren't retro, they were just games. In 2019, it seems to me that there's been a sort of uptick over the past 5 years in terms of popularity of retro games. What do you think has led to that?
Yeah, I think it's the internet and people playing them more and more. For me, I play League of Legends, which is quite an old game now, but it's still got a huge community. And a really interesting thing that came out recently was World of Warcraft. People were starting to put retro servers on. So they were putting the first version of Warcraft out and people were kind of going on that. And then it kept getting shut down by Blizzard. Now, Blizzard have actually decided to start World of Warcraft again from the original style. And, it was a lot harder. There was lot more grinding you had to do and stuff like that. But people really miss that experience. So I think longevity of games is kind of a thing that's really changing the scene at the moment, and especially with MMO RPGs, And
I also think in terms of consoles and people kind of rediscovering their childhood, I'd say, for people who grew up in the late 70s and 80s, I mean, they were really the first generation of video games players. And then you think the timing of it, I mean, I wasn't alive in the 70s, but I consider myself, maybe a first or second generation video gamer, having started gaming in about 1985, 86. But I'd say that people that enjoyed games back then are kind of rediscovering their youth, because they're probably at an age now where they've got jobs, they're comfortable enough in their life that maybe they've got a bit of disposable income. And for me, it was more a case of not only kind of reliving my youth in a way, I mean, in the same way that people do with music, I guess, you listen to music from your teenage years again a lot when you're older, but also the fact that you've now got the money to buy these systems that you probably couldn't afford when you were a kid. I mean, when I was a kid, I couldn't have afforded to have a Super Nintendo and a Mega Drive and a Nintendo 64. Your parents might get you one for Christmas every 4 or 5 years. But I think there's a case of being able to have something that was a bit unattainable when you were a kid, you always really wanted. So I think that's probably come out of it. And obviously the popularity of it that's really skyrocketed in the last decade. I think Ravi made a good point there with the internet, because I think a lot of it is thanks to the big retro gaming YouTube channels like Angry Video Game Nerd, for example, who has got millions of subscribers. So they're often introducing these classic systems to people who'd either forgotten about them or didn't get a chance to experience them first time round. And, it's kind of proven with you. You said you're 18 years old, and a lot of modern gamers kind of look back and think, I wonder where this came from, and they want to kind of experience the things that led to games that we have today.
For sure. Now, you mentioned retro video game YouTube channels. Not too long ago, you did an interview with Jason of Metal Jesus Rocks. He's got one of the most impressive all-around video game collections. And although some may say that this question might be better suited for a guy like him, do you, Dan and Ravi, have any advice for someone looking to start a retro game collection and what to look for?
Oh, yeah, because I collect CD32 games, Amiga ones, and I'd say the best thing to do is look on other eBays. So look on like the French eBay, the German one, and also the American one. And what you can do sometimes is you can get deliveries to PO boxes or places in America, and then they will resend it back to you in the UK, and it will actually be quite cheaper. So you can do a lot of international stuff with that, but also check the listings like these app sites like Spock and a few other of these kind of car boot selling sites. Gumtree's quite good for stuff, and just don't overpay. Like, I've waited 3 years for certain titles to come up at a decent price, and if you go to shows, if you hang around the retro community, you eventually will be able to build up a collection. There's no need to go out and spend £20,000 on a complete pristine collection when you could probably build it up yourself over time.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'm not much of a game collector in terms of software. I mean, I collect the hardware. So, I've got pretty much every console, I can think of, and a load of computers. And it's more about the systems for me. Really, I'd say if you want to get into retro gaming, it depends on your experience. Maybe you want to get into a system that you had as a kid, or you want to try something new, a platform that you haven't experienced before. A really good way to dip your toe in would be, like you mentioned, RetroArch, emulate these systems. So you can download an emulator for most systems for free and run it on your computer, on your PC. And the games, there's a lot of websites around called abandonware websites, which in terms of legality, not strictly legal. Some companies care more than others. For example, Nintendo generally take down any site serving their old games, even going back to the Nintendo in the 80s, the NES. But other companies like Sega, for example, and other consoles that you may think of, Amigas, that kind of thing, home computers, generally you can find complete collections on the internet that you can download, either as individual files or as torrents. So I'd say if you want to dip your toe in, emulate the systems, try them out, see what you think. And then if you do have a taste for actually getting the hardware yourself, like Ravi said, do a bit of bargain hunting, because the price of these things is going up every year. I remember 15 years ago, you could pick up a Sega Genesis for about £10 over here. Now I see them going for about 100 now. So the price of them is going up. I actually got given a computer, an Amiga 600, that goes for about £100 now, for free in about 2005. Because I wanted to get a game. I bought a game off eBay, and the guy's, you may as well have the computer as well. You don't really see that kind of thing anymore. But yeah, it's looking for, Facebook Marketplace often has cheaper prices than eBay or Craigslist, or, sites like that, for example, might be a good little place. And also look for typing errors as well. You'd be surprised how many people list those systems and they spell the name of the system a little bit wrong. So often if you do some common misspellings, you may be able to find a little sale or an auction that other people haven't spotted.
For sure. Now, you mentioned the whole RetroArch thing. I grew up, the first console, this is going to make me sound like I shouldn't be playing video games at all if this was my first console. My first console that I grew up with was the Wii. I got it for Christmas, I believe, Christmas 2007. And then I got a DS Lite a year later. I'm drawn, I don't know what it is, to the N64. Like, it sort of has this, I don't want to say it has the same style of graphics, because the graphics of the Wii were improved exponentially since the N64, what with the release of the GameCube in between the two. But the N64 has just some of the most timeless titles to me, either the N64 or the SNES there.
Yeah, to me, the N64 represented a different time for Nintendo. I kind of touched on this before. When the Wii came along, it was really a system that was, they didn't want to try and keep up in terms of graphics and resolution and fidelity with stuff like the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Really, Nintendo, even today, you look at the Switch, it's not as powerful as like the PS4 Pro, for example. It's Nintendo now focus on their first-party titles and the kind of experience, the family friendliness and the fun. But when the N64 came out, it was really a different story. It was, Nintendo then at the time partnered with a company called Silicon Graphics, who made these multi-million-dollar workstations that, movies like Jurassic Park were made on these workstations. And they did a graphics chip for the N64. So really it was kind of talked about at the time like you're having a multi-million-dollar workstation condensed into a console. and this is the most futuristic next generation system. So really at the time, Nintendo were the forerunners in terms of technical innovation, whereas now they kind of don't compete in that sphere. So it was really the last Nintendo console that kind of was the trendsetter. So I think for that reason, it makes it quite interesting.
And everyone kind of thinks that the PlayStation was the one that blew everybody's mind when the video footage came out. But the Saturn was quite close to the PlayStation, so it didn't actually have that much impact. But when Mario 64 came out, my God, it was like seeing something created by aliens or something. It's like we'd never seen a kind of sandbox environment that you could run around in that way and it just be so comical and so kind of smooth, in real time. It was really mind blowing when that came out, and the PlayStation just sounded like some weird thing from Japan that was kind of for fighting games or RPG or something. But the N64 was really, I remember the impact when I was a kid. It was amazing.
And it's a weird thing to say because now, I mean, when a new system comes out, from the PS3 to the PS4 and the Pro, and it's generally a more subtle increase in power. But then, in the 90s in particular, it seemed like every couple of years, you went from the systems like the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation to the N64, then the PS2, all within a decade. And every one that came out felt like it was, 10 times better than the one that came before. So you really had to have it because it was just so improved.
For sure. Now, you mentioned the Sega Saturn. What was, I don't know what it was with Sega after the Mega Drive, after the Genesis. It seemed that Sega's consoles, even going back as far as the 32X or the Sega CD, their consoles seemed to sort of they would hype them up amazingly, and then they would just crash. What do you think sort of led to that?
I think it was there's a new book coming out. There's a book come out called Console Wars, and that's just going to be made into a series on Netflix with Seth Rogen. And that is all about how Sega kind of killed themselves because Sega Japan were kind of really annoyed that it wasn't massively popular in Japan, and Sega America were doing fantastically well. And it kind of led to a clash between both of them where they weren't communicating with each other. So when the 32X and the Sega CD came out at the same time, it caused total confusion because I remember everybody with a Mega Drive, I remember the Sonic and Knuckles add-ons and stuff, but not people buying all the Sega CD and all this extra stuff. It was all seen as kind of filler, waiting for the new console. And then it was just really confused. And when the Saturn came out as well with the cartridge slot on it, everyone kind of assumed that you'd be able to be backwards compatible and play your old games on it. And it was just really strange. I remember all of the sports companies pulling out of Sega Saturn, and that led to Sega Sports having to kind of take over. But it led to a good series like Virtua Tennis and stuff like that. But that was really the start of it when EA and those guys started to leave.
Yeah, and we actually did an interview with Tom Kalinske on our show, who used to be the CEO of Sega America. And he gave us a whole story behind the Saturn. And really, I mean, you look back at Sega's history, they only really had one major hit in the console market, and that was, the Genesis/Mega Drive. All of the other systems really weren't that much of a success around the world. But the thing about the Saturn is that it was a next-generation system, 32-bit. But at the time, they wanted to release it in Japan. Over in America, the Genesis was still phenomenally successful. And Sega of America weren't in a position where they wanted to replace it just yet because it was selling so well. So again, they came up with this stopgap, the 32X, that was an addition that you plug into your Genesis. And it was another console that would plug into your existing machine and give it some, enhanced capabilities. But, I mean, when that system was released in Europe and North America, we were reading in all the gaming magazines that Sega had this next-generation console, the Saturn, that was about to be released. So nobody wanted to buy this stopgap solution when they knew that a whole new system was coming along. But even when the Saturn was launched, Sega of Japan messed it up again by insisting that Sega of America brought the launch date of the system earlier to get it out there before the PlayStation. But that meant that caught all of the developers short, and all these companies that were developing software for it, who assumed they had another 6 months to get their games finished, were suddenly told, this system's going on sale today, which really annoyed all the developers, and Sega never really recovered from that.
And then they did some incredibly stupid moves, like in Japan, it was starting to actually gain traction, and it was with RPGs. And then the head of Sega came up and said, there's no future in RPGs on the Saturn, and pretty much destroyed the whole market instantly.
As soon as he said that, yeah, I'm just looking at the history of Sega a little bit here. The 32X came out a day, like in North America. The 32X came out a day before the Saturn was released in Japan.
Yeah, and they both didn't know about the projects as well. Yeah. So imagine that.
So
you've been working on something for years, and then suddenly the other guys go, wait, we've got this. You're like,
so
what?
Was the head of Sega America at the time let go by the head of Sega Japan after he found out what was going on? Like, it just...
He left, yeah. I mean, Tom Kalinske was forced essentially to, introduce these products, especially the Saturn. He was forced to go on stage and announce that it was on sale today, 6 months ahead of time. And after that, he left. He just didn't see there was any future of the company. Rightly so.
Right. Now, the Dreamcast was released a couple years later. This one being it was the second CD full console that Sega released, if I'm correct there, yeah?
Yeah.
The Mega CD that was an add-on, and then the Saturn, then the Dreamcast.
Yeah. Now, the Dreamcast, I've heard a lot of good things about. What do you think sort of led to the death of the Dreamcast, though?
I think the Dreamcast, from what I heard, I don't know if this is right, but it was an investor who was very passionate about Sega, and by that time they were absolutely completely ruined, and they didn't really have that much facilities to produce a console. But I think he actually put quite a lot of money in because he just wanted to see the Dreamcast happen. But it was such a good machine, but it was very flawed. Like, I think the fact it couldn't play DVDs, it didn't have a DVD player in it, was a big thing. And it was also, I remember my friend got one up the road, and the day that he'd got one, he had a CD that would boot cracked games. Like the day that he got them. So we were sitting there downloading Dreamcast games, tons of them, and just playing it. I think they'd put in tons of piracy protection, including drilling holes in the discs and stuff. But they'd actually left a silly format which was called Mill CD. I think it was for karaoke or something, and then they managed to crack it that way. But it was very innovative. It led to a lot of design stuff later on. The Xbox actually was very similar to the Dreamcast.
Yeah, and it was a great system, and a lot of people still talk very fondly about the Dreamcast. Every retro gamer I talk to always rates the Dreamcast in their top 5 systems at least. But those are the three things that really led to its demise. The one that that already had this big misstep with the Saturn, and then Bernie Stolar, who came along, and he was the president of Sega of America at that time. He essentially killed the Saturn by saying it's not our future. And they'd already burned all their roads with the developers. So none of these big companies like EA and that, for example, were going to develop games for the Dreamcast. So that really hurt it. And then the thing that really was a death knell was the PlayStation 2. I mean, when that system came along, like Ravi said then, with a DVD player built in, you've got to remember in the year 2000, a lot of people still use VHS videos at home. So to get a system with a DVD player built in for the cheaper price than a standalone DVD player that could play video games too, had the PlayStation branding, I mean, it was very difficult for them to compete with that.
It was kind of like, should I buy a Dreamcast or should I wait a couple of months for the PS2 with a DVD player? Everyone
knew it was coming.
Yeah.
For sure. No, sorry, go ahead.
And that was the same with the PlayStation 1, actually. When people heard about the specs of the PlayStation 1, and then the Saturn came out and stuff, people were just like, no, we're going to wait for the Sony one,
Definitely. No, I'm just reading up more on the history of what sort of killed the Dreamcast. I'm reading here that it was Isao Okawa that became president of Sega on the 22nd of May in 2000, Okawa died 14 days before the Sega Dreamcast did. So would it be technically wrong to say that the Dreamcast died with Isao Okawa?
Well, I think it was dying at the time anyway.
Yeah.
But maybe that was one of the the final nails in the coffin for it, maybe. But I imagine that decision would have been made more than a fortnight before it's done.
But also there was a lot of crossover with the Xbox, so people kind of say that it died, but the controller design went onto the Duke stuff. There was a lot of the team from Dreamcast went over, and there was a lot of cross between that. So kind of the ashes of the Dreamcast are inside the Xbox. That's what I like to think.
Yeah, well, the Xbox, Microsoft actually worked with Sega on the Dreamcast because it ran an operating system layer called a Windows CE. So Microsoft were involved in the creation of the Dreamcast itself. So then, like Ravi said, a lot of that kind of design decision went into the Xbox, and that kind of the Dreamcast was really Microsoft's first attempt in the console market at putting their finger in, I guess, and then they used what they learned with developing the Xbox.
Yeah. Now, a couple questions before we wrap things up here. A question about handhelds here. We have Nintendo, who have been releasing handhelds since they've released consoles, basically. They always released handhelds in succession to whatever console they had out at the time. Sony sort of did the exact same thing, but the one company that's really surprising to me that's never released a handheld and has never really said anything about releasing handhelds is Microsoft. What do you think Microsoft's thought process is in not releasing a handheld system at all?
I think, personally, I'm a Surface user. So that was kind of one of the first pieces of actual Microsoft hardware that I got. Like, I got the Xbox and stuff before, but, they didn't release hardware for a long time. They kind of stuck on the consoles, but there was no kind of surfaces or small devices, and they've just started getting into that, and they're making a bit of a dent in Mac's kind of area. But I guess if you're creating a retro console, you need stuff like an LCD division that's going to be able to make the small screens. You need to source small components and parts, and I don't think they probably had the facilities to do that. They probably do now that they've started making the tablets and stuff like that. So we never know what we could see in the future. Maybe an Xbox like a Switch or something. That might be amazing.
Yeah, we've done episodes before with guys from Microsoft. Now, I do believe, I did read an interview with Phil Spencer a while ago from Microsoft, and he was saying that they did actually design, internally, they did get a handheld Xbox running. But really they were more about the television experience. I mean, they have got the capability to do it, but I think it's always been a traditionally difficult market for any other company, bizarrely, than Nintendo to compete in. I mean, you think of the other companies that have tried over the years. I mean, we had Sega with the Game Gear. We had the Atari Lynx in the early 90s. The Sony devices, the PSP and the PS Vita, they weren't really that successful. I mean,
never perform well, have they?
Yeah, no, only Nintendo have really managed to get a success over the last 3 decades in the handheld market, really. Everyone else loses money on it.
Yeah, like the Game Boy, the DS, they will do fantastically well.
Yeah, and the Switch today, yeah.
Now, we're going to wrap things up here in a little bit. Rapid fire, I've got maybe 3 rapid fire questions for the both of you. 5 favorite games released before 2000. Go.
Oh, 5 favorite games released 2000: Syndicate, Lemmings, Worms Director's Cut, Unreal Tournament. I don't know if that hits it. Yeah, it's probably early. And a Counter-Strike, probably, if that is pre-2000.
What was that, about 7?
Yeah, that's 5, yeah.
Okay, let me think. Golden Axe. One of my favourite arcade games of all time. Love Golden Axe. I've got to say Lemmings as well. I know you just said it, Ravi, but Lemmings is probably my favourite puzzle game franchise of all time. I loved a game called Rainbow Islands, a platform game. That's one of my favourite platformers. Sonic the Hedgehog 2, I think, would be my favourite in that series.
You've got to get Monkey Island in there, Dan.
Oh, I was thinking of an adventure game. Yeah, probably Monkey Island 2 as well. That would be my 5.
All right, now you're like, it's probably going to be easier to do 5 least favorite video games of all time.
God,
that is hard.
there was an awful one called Baby Joe Going Home on the Amiga, which was like 13 frames per second. I absolutely hated that. Oh God, I was a fan of Tomb Raider 1, but then I went to play it the other day, and that made me feel really sick. Doom used to make me feel quite sick at some point.
Tomb Raider and Doom in your top 5 worst games.
Nowadays, it's hard to think actually the worst games because I just tend to turn them off.
Yeah, it's the same for me. I mean, some of the games I really didn't like. I mean, like stuff like Dragon's Lair and Space Ace that were kind of these games that were a lot of great visuals, but they just had no gameplay to them, and it was all timing, and I hate those kind of games. And I've never been a massive fan of. I mean, I was playing the other day on I put this on our Instagram. I was playing the game called Mad Dog McCree. That was like a light gun game, and again, it's all about timing. I've never been a big fan of kind of light gun games either. I know a lot of our team do love stuff like Time Crisis and Point Blank, that kind of thing, but I've never been a huge fan of those kind of games. Even going back to Duck Hunt, maybe because my hand-to-eye coordination is not good enough to be any good at them. Maybe. Actually,
Zelda. I've never really been into Zelda. That's one thing that I've never been into. Yeah, all the Zelda games. There you go.
and if we're talking today, I mean stuff like. Even though I tend to get them all, I do buy them every year. I must admit, the new Call of Duty games, but I hate myself for doing it because every year it's the same thing, dressed up, slightly different graphics. And I think, the way Activision have handled that game in recent years and the lack of innovation behind it, yes, some of those have got to rank up there.
For sure. Now, that brings us to the end of our interview today. Thank you guys for coming on. Where can we find you on social media?
I'm theretrohour.com, and I'm at Retro Ravi.
Yeah, like Ravi said, our website, theretrohour.com. If you search for the Retro Hour podcast, I think we are Retro Hour UK. That's our handle on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So you can find us there, or any podcast client. We're on the Apple Podcast app and Google Play Store and Stitcher and Spotify. So anyway, you get your podcast from, you can find us, or just nip to our website and you'll find us there.
For sure. Now, this will be released probably tonight or something. Can you give us a little bit of a preview for this coming week's episode?
Yeah, we recorded it last night. I'm trying to think.
Yes. Yeah, so I talked to the Sega company in Brazil, basically. It's crazy. So it's Tectoy. This Brazilian games company and toy company, and they got licensed by Sega years ago. And in Brazil, you have to manufacture and build everything yourself. So they have these manufacturing plants, and they've actually got their own kind of Sega industry still going out there. So they produce Master Systems still. They've done over 1,000 games. They produce Mega Drives as well still. So we're going to be talking to them about actual modern Sega. It's crazy.
Huh. All right, Dan Abbott, Ravi Wood. Dan Wood, Ravi Abbott, thank you guys for coming on to the show.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Perfect. All right. To hear all former episodes of Pixels and Piledrivers, make sure to check out 8bitwrestling.ca or check us out wherever you can find your favorite podcasts.